Have doctors been overdiagnosing ADHD, needlessly prescribing pills to perfectly healthy young people? While this has long been a topic in alternative media, the mainstream is starting to ask these questions too. The New York Times recently ran an in-depth look at the issue, provocatively asking whether, quote, we've been getting ADHD all wrong. Now, our next guest welcomes the New York Times scrutiny of this issue, but thinks maybe they're missing a part of the equation, and that is social contagion. Freddie DeBoer is an author and self-dubbed Marxist who nevertheless often spars with what progressives and other leftists think about political topics. He wrote a Substack piece that challenges the notion that behavioral disorder is even a thing. He writes for Substack that there is now a vast and deeply annoying ADHD culture online that acts as a kind of evangelical movement for ADHD.
DeBoer highlights how the explosion of the neurodivergent disorder has also lured in people looking to make a buck off of those claiming to have the behavioral condition. Here to elaborate is writer Freddie DeBoer. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm a fan of your work. I've wanted to get you on the show to talk about a great number of subjects, but this seems like a good one to get into. I really liked the New York Times article taking a look, or a kind of second look, at the ADHD phenomenon. But what you really focused in on is the social contagion aspect that was not discussed in great detail in the New York Times. Can you tell our viewers what you mean by that, and how there's an industry and a social media environment and a whole culture around that maybe lures people? I don't want to say that what you're suffering from something is like made up in all cases or anything of that nature, but can encourage people who really are perfectly healthy to view themselves in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to start with the fact that social contagion as a vector of disease is something that we've known about for more than 100 years. This is a phenomenon that has been deepened and extended by online life, by hyperconnectivity, by the ability to plug into these vast networks all the time. But there are cases going back, like I said, more than a century ago, of groups of people through which a disorder that has presumably some underlying physiological or neurological basis spreads in a way that is highly implausible medically. And the presumption, and what's been fairly well documented in the past, is that a disorder comes to become a kind of marker of an insider status. It denotes a particular sort of social status. And if you look at a illness like ADHD, you will find that online there is an absolutely vast edifice of ADHD culture, ADHD media. There are multiple websites that are dedicated just to people with ADHD. There are innumerable forums and groups for people with ADHD. There are these groups that put together social events just for people with ADHD. There's networking just for people with ADHD, etc. And what seems clear to me is that obviously there are people whose neurology puts them at a certain particular extreme on certain parts of sort of like the neurological spectrum in a way that damages their ability to concentrate, and they deserve sort of medical care and medical attention. But there's also a lot of people who look at all this stuff and say, wow, that seems like fun. This is an opportunity to get attention. This is an opportunity to get sympathy. And with ADHD in particular, this is an opportunity to get access to prescription stimulants, which lots of people enjoy using, even if they don't have anything. And I think it is bizarre to write a big brick stop piece about the rise of ADHD in the world's biggest newspaper, and not even for a second really consider the fact that this looks like an entertaining club to join.
Well, let me ask you this on that thread. A lot of parents, and I know a lot of parents who look at a number of options before they end up with medication for their child. A lot of them say this is the choice that I have now that I've looked into many options. Do you think that many parents actually want to prescribe this to their kids?
Well, I think that is a good sort of hint at part of what's going on here, which is that even in terms of its sort of fundamental diagnostic sort of criteria, if you go back a few decades, ADHD was considered to simply be a disorder of childhood. And in fact, if you look at a great deal of the literature from that period, even from just 30 or 40 years ago, the presumption among a lot of the medical personnel is that ADHD ceases to be meaningfully a neurological disorder when people reach adulthood. But what's changed now is that a vast number of people who have ADHD were not diagnosed in their childhood, but rather were diagnosed in adulthood. And a vast portion of those are self-diagnosed. So I think it's really important to say that one of the core elements of this, the rise of this disorder and some related phenomenon, such as with autism, is that the activist class, the disability rights activist class that has powered a lot of these changes, insists that self-diagnosis is exactly as valid and exactly as real as diagnosis from medical personnel. So I certainly think that many or most parents would probably avoid a diagnosis if they can avoid it and medication. But many individuals will happily leap at the chance to sort of define themselves in these ways. And I also think that, frankly, American parents, particularly elites who are raising children to be academically competitive, will also sort of cynically take advantage of the fact that people with ADHD get accommodations on their work, more time to work, et cetera, and again, access to stimulant medication, which could improve them in the college rat race. So I just knowing what I understand about human nature, it wouldn't surprise me if people were acting in that way.
Yeah, I think it's worth teasing that out in a little bit greater detail. That's something you've written about that's always intrigued me about your work, and I've observed similar phenomenons in elite educational spaces, the need to have some kind of victim or trauma-based narrative in order to sell yourself in terms of admissions, in terms of job applications. So what do you, an otherwise, very affluent, if you're a white person who's not suffered race-based discrimination, if you grew up affluent, how can you have but I was a victim to kind of thing to make yourself appealing on paper? I mean, it's kind of gross to even talk about, but one thing is to have this culture of, self-diagnosis or self-identification around trauma or mental illness or problems like this. At the same time, I read through what are supposed to be the symptoms of ADHD, and it just sounds like, to a certain degree, individual preference and personality. It's like inattentiveness to detail or only caring about some things but not others. Doesn't that describe all of us? Aren't all of us sometimes forgetful or more attentive to the things that matter to us and not other things, whether it's one subject versus another or one interest versus another? It starts to be like so vague that you could really ascribe this to anyone, which gives it that power. If you're looking for something to say, here's something I have wrong with me, to make me an appealing candidate.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really big part of this sort of online ADHD community is just mushrooming the number of symptoms over and over again so that the definition becomes so capacious, no one could find themselves outside of it. So if you go into a Google image search, for example, and you put in ADHD memes, you're going to find a lot of people saying things like that, for example, you ever go downstairs to get something, and by the time you get down there, you forgot what it was you went to get? You might have ADHD, right? Like that is an experience that is absolutely common across the human sort of the human race, right? That's the kind of experience that all of us have from time to time.
It happened to me this morning,
And
Freddie.
there's not just
It happened to me
yeah,
today.
I mean, there's thousands of these memes. Like one of my favorites is a very popular one, which has been shared tens of thousands of times in these communities, is, are you the kind of ADHD person who has a browser full of 100 open tabs? Or are you the kind of ADHD person who has a browser with only one tab because you're so hyper-focused on it? And I want to just take a second to sort of look at what that means. It's asserting that literally a behavior and its exact opposite are both proof of the same neurodevelopmental disorder, right? And this gets back to this sort of sense that people want to be included, but they also want stories about their lives, right? I think a big part of this is almost never is this done with malicious intent. I think that rather we sort of are wandering around in a modern life that really provides us with very few sort of senses of like Am I a good person? Am I a successful person? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be? And then you have these narratives about these disabilities, which they appear to sort of give shape and direction to everything that you do. All the things that you do that bother you or that confuse you, everything that you've done that you try to wonder why you're that kind of person, these things sort of in these cultures become omni-explanatory systems for your whole life,
Well, Freddie,
which
I
is
think just
seductive.
to point to that, there may be some who, as you're pointing out, who are in that vein, going in that direction, right? Who are saying, well, I'm distracted all the time and those kinds of things. But there are other very real cases of this that are often tied to, as that New York Times article pointed out, anxiety and other conditions that the child might have. And I'm talking about children because the parent at the end of the day is the one who's going to say, okay, I'm going to okay this prescription, right? And so I think we look at, what is the solution here? Because experts have said it's neurological, it's also environmental. Is the solution that, hey, we need more research in this? Is the solution to slow down, the amount that we're actually prescribing? What would you say? What's your take on what the solution is? Because look, there's always going to be memes about something. The internet's always going to be, making jokes about one thing or another. But I just want to say that this is a serious topic, right?
Of course it is, but I think that that's kind of the point, right? Like, so, for example, to sort of like pull it into the way that you're talking about, what is the right thing to do? Well, I am someone who writes a lot about academia. I was in academia for many years. I'm sort of plugged into a lot of educational circles, and I write about this disability stuff. I've had at least a half dozen college instructors tell me that they're now in a situation where a majority of the students in their class have some sort of an accommodation, educational accommodation, in terms of like taking more time for a test or more time to do work, etc. In terms of like providing these educational accommodations, they have more students who have those than don't. Some of them describe classes where 3/4 of their students at these elite, Ivy League or elite institutions are showing up every day saying, I have a special accommodation to be able to take more time on test or to be able to turn in my work late or whatever. And at some point you say, okay, is 3/4 of the students getting an accommodation? Or is the other quarter of the students getting an unfair penalty? I mean, at a certain penetration point, if these things become so common, you have to really wonder what does it mean to say the nature of like a disability or a disorder? I mean, you mentioned the New York Times piece. I believe the quote was that something like in some of the research, something like 25% or a quarter of American males under the age of 25 have had an ADHD diagnosis, right? When you're getting to those kind of numbers, it kind of just destroys the notion of a norm and then a disorder that underlies it. Now, what I would say is this. I think that there are spectrums for a lot of these behaviors, and that you can be at the extreme of a spectrum, which makes it difficult for you to be able to concentrate. And I don't think that we need to be miserly when it comes to sort of handing out understanding and accommodation. But at some point, right, the edifice of disability, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the legal concept of accommodation, is so important to protect that we have to better define what we're talking about here. The people that I respect the most are the ones who say, I feel that I need Ritalin or I need Adderall to do my office job, and so I got this diagnosis. In other words, they have a perfectly, completely sort of utilitarian approach where they say, yes, I do this to get access to a stimulant medication because it makes my life better. That's something that I understand and I don't have a problem with, right? As long as we're not contributing to sort of degrade the notion of a protective class of people who are suffering from a real disability. And I think one of the things that the New York Times piece does well is it really undermines the question of whether the accommodations we're providing people with help at all.
Absolutely. Freddie DeBoer, thank you so much for joining us to discuss this topic. Really fascinating insights. We appreciate it. Up next, the White House completely revamps their official COVID website, transforming it into Lab Leak Central. Stay tuned.